Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Betty Ann Hedges, the Executive Director of Humanist Canada. Welcome. As always, this recording will be available after this event on all of our various platforms. We are recording live on April 6, 2024. I'm very pleased to introduce to you today Derek Forgy and Jill Fletcher-Douglas, two of our program committee volunteers. And Derek is going to introduce our guests today.
It's true. Hello. Hi, everybody. Yes, my name is Derek. I'm going to be with you for this. I am a relatively new humanist to the game, and I have the task of introducing my first guest ever. This is very exciting. First, we have Maureen Bulbrook. She's Indigenous Counsel for the Office of the Children's Lawyer, and I insisted personally that she bring her sister along, who is also a legal aid lawyer. Christina Ninham is also here. So we say welcome to you. Welcome. Hello.
Hello.
And thank you for being here on this Saturday afternoon.
Yes, thank you for inviting us to speak. This is great.
My sister said we're speaking on this day. I said, okay.
Perfect.
So we sign each other up for lots of stuff and say, hey, we're doing this. Okay.
That's nice.
Nice. That's good. Like any good comedy team, you just got to go with it. You just got to roll with it.
For sure. We always compare ourselves to the two guys that are up in the balcony and on the Muppets. You know,
Oh, Statler and Waldorf.
Back and forth.
Oh, yes.
I didn't know they had names.
They have names. I'm pretty sure they've been married for a good 50 years. But anyway, though they just have a chemistry that is undeniable. It's this a good healthy relationship. No, the first thing I would like to get out is sort of the irony of acknowledging that we're actually not doing a land acknowledgement. I was asked by the humanist to sort of not bring it up or not do the land acknowledgement off the top because I don't know what your experience is, but with me, I've heard sort of ranging opinions on what land acknowledgements mean, which range anywhere from, condescending lip service all the way up to it's an important first step in the road to reconciliation, and then sort of about 20 different opinions in between. That's my experience, but I'm really curious as to know what your relationship or what your feeling is towards land acknowledgements. Do you appreciate them, or do you find them, as the kids say, cringy? Where do you stand with them right now? I'm curious.
So from my perspective, I mean, the land acknowledgements are part of the recommendations of the TRC, right?
Right.
That there should be some land acknowledgements that are said. My issue sometimes is that it only provides like a lip service and, sorry, here, we have this land that, you were stewards on for a very long time and looked after, and thank you very much, but you're never getting it back, right? For me, land acknowledgements should have a educational component to them. That's one way people are going to learn about why they're actually doing them. And there should be some information that's contained in the land acknowledgements. And sometimes they even get it wrong about which First Nations that they're, they're acknowledging the land where, that they're on. And sometimes they don't always get a lot of land acknowledgements acknowledge which treaties that they're on, but they only go back so far. And there's other treaties that they're missing in the land acknowledgements because they're not doing the research and they're not doing, getting that information to share. My experience too is, my colleagues at my work, they do ask, for my input for land acknowledgements to see how it is. And for example, if it's someone, if it's about, say, youth homelessness, one of the things that I like and that I've encouraged is, if you're going to speak on a topic, like tie it into the land acknowledgement about the statistics of Indigenous people tied into that topic, because then it makes it more real, right?
I get frustrated because most of the time, probably like 80% of the ones that I've been to don't even pronounce the names right. Yeah. So they can't say Haudenosaunee or they can't say Anishinaabe, or they have a hard time with like whatever they're trying to say. Right. And then I'm like thinking, how respectful is that? Like you're literally doing a land acknowledgement for acknowledging people that you can't even pronounce.
Yeah.
So
that's a good point.
Probably like the first thing that drives me crazy with land acknowledgements. And the second thing is, one of the things that we've done in presentations we've given is we did foster parent training at one of the agencies. And when they came in, we actually like basically asked for their car keys, and we changed some of the names that people had, and we took their car keys. And basically we ended up saying, well, this is our car now. You don't ever get it back. And if you want to ride somewhere, sometimes we may give you a ride, but really no, we're gonna just do whatever we want with it, and it's ours now. So I think that in itself, like really, I think people like, oh my God, like is that is that what happened?
And we're
Like,
going to call it a Porsche and not a Porsche. Wow.
Yeah.
exactly. It is so like it's really I don't enjoy them. And unless they're gonna say what they're gonna do to try and address it, just short of joining in some type of revolution to ensure that equality happens for everyone.
Mhm.
And so like I just don't like them.
That's
Yeah,
excellent.
that's what I keep hearing. I hear that a lot. And the through line that I seem to hear is like it does feel like lip service, especially when nothing follows it up. So what I do, because I have limited time, whenever I'm at the mic or I'm doing one, I add another little step, which is like the simplest, easiest bit of homework, which I encourage people. I kind of I don't really make it optional. I make it kind of mandatory. I say go to nativeland.ca and type in your address, not just where you live, but also where you work. The place where you spend a lot of time. Go to nativeland.ca and find out what land you're on. And I know that that website is not 100% accurate either, but at least it gives you a chance to go, oh, I'm sitting on Haudenosaunee land right now. Maybe the hope is that that will be like a gateway to them going, well, maybe I should learn what that word actually means. So yeah, I do. So the thing I keep hearing is like, it means nothing if it doesn't go further than that. So, and I love
Right.
the car key analogy. That is so good. I may,
Feel free.
at the risk of sounding colonial, I may have to take that and use it.
Use it for sure.
That's
It's
really
a
good.
great one because
like
it's not a water bottle where everyone's like, who cares? It's a water bottle. You like we
No,
literally take
that's really
their
good.
keys.
We do. We take their keys during the training and they're like, what do you do? And it's like, well,
That's so good.
ask them what kind of car they're driving, of course.
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah, and
We
make
want
sure
to
you
make sure it's resource rich.
That's right. And make sure you mispronounce it like Misebushi or something.
That's right. That's right.
I would like to get to the wedding table question, if that's all right. You know, when you go to a wedding and sometimes you're at a table with people that you don't necessarily know, and more often than not, people will say, "So, what do you do for a living?" And you give them kind of a concise answer. So, for the folks who don't know what you do, can you just walk us through a typical day of what your job entails and what you do for a living?
Our jobs are the same but different. So I stopped taking parent files in family law matters and child protection matters. So right now I represent children through the Office of the Children's Lawyer, and I've been doing that for 20 years. And I represent First Nations. So I have quite a few First Nations in their child protection matters and helping them assert their inherent jurisdiction in the court over their children.
Hmm.
And I'm Indigenous counsel at the Office of the Children's Lawyer. So,
Right now, I supervise the Indigenous child files across Ontario, the panel agents. I'm not allowed to supervise my sister though. The connection's too close. And I also represent children too in court matters, mostly child protection. And occasionally I'll take on a parenting decision-making file and represent a child in those.
Can you go
Okay.
back further, just to break your flow, Derek? Can you go back further? Where did you grow up? What was
Yeah.
your experience, your lived experience, and your motivation? Your motivation is actually quite obvious. The need of your.
I wanted to be a psychologist. I
Did you?
didn't want to be a lawyer. Well, I went because law school is easier to get into.
Ah,
So they take far more people into law school every year than they do here for
Okay.
psychology. But so basically we grew up in Hamilton and we have 4 brothers, 2 older, 2 younger. My sister is less than a year older than I. So she did a victory lab before it was cool so that we could go to school together. And we did. We went to University of Windsor together and we did our undergrads and then we went to law school together. And then in law school, I met my husband, who was from Oneida. So that's where I veered off there. When I was done, I moved to Oneida. And then my sister, she stayed in Windsor for a bit and then moved back to Hamilton.
Hmm. So did you grow up in the city of Hamilton or,
Yes,
yeah, so not in the reserve, on the reserve, but in
right.
the city? I grew up in Hagersville, so just off Six Nations. Yeah.
But you probably dealt with more Indigenous people than we did on the daily, because we grew up in like a fairly homogenized area. And we were probably one of like 3 Native families, maybe. And so we didn't go to school. Like, it was not a diverse school. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. What a different experience. Even, you
Yeah.
know, we're literally looking at this from both sides, and my day to day, you're probably right. It was more, interesting. Okay.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, not that it's competition, but you won. I've only did 3 years in Hamilton. I went to Elizabeth Bagshaw School in grade 2, so it's not like other than, do you really? You know the Elizabeth Bagshaw?
I knew where it was, yeah.
I have virtually no memory of it, so yeah. So I'm a Northern Ontario guy, so Mattawa, Ontario is where I'm from. So it was so we had a very high ratio with Indigenous students, and again, you know, it wasn't until I was in my 30s looking back on it, I was just like, why was this culture never celebrated? Like, Mattawa, Ontario is such a vitally important community in the story of Canada and the history of Indigenous people. And I'm like, why are we talking about Jacques Cartier every week? You know, why is it? Why
Even
is
the name is
yeah,
Indigenous.
I
Like,
know, it's right in the name. Yeah, it's like the extent of my Indigenous education through my entire elementary school and high school career was Mattawa. It is an Ojibwe word for where the waters meet. Anyway, Jacques Cartier, what a guy.
Right.
Like,
That's a good
that's it.
example.
I had to do all the work myself. Which we'll circle back to in a sec. What I'm curious about is going back to the important work that you do. My wife is a preschool teacher. And I think she has one of those jobs that's kind of thankless in that, you know, she has an age, it's, you know, 2.5 to 5, where she has such influence over who they'll become, and they'll remember her the least as far as age goes. And you have one of those jobs too that is so taxing and so vitally important and so thankless. So what I'm curious about, like, what gets you up in the morning? What gets you out of bed? What do you look forward to in this, you know, obviously taxing and difficult and emotionally heavy job?
Oh my God, Derek, right now, that's a loaded question.
Okay.
Like right
We
now,
can take a caller. Should we take a caller?
so my sister and I have been practicing law for 23 years now. Because we were called on the same day. And just to let you know, yeah. So
I have more seniority.
she does. Her name's mine was an M. She got to cross the stage before I did. So she's the more senior lawyer, and I'm the older sister.
Oh, that's funny. That's
Yes.
funny.
So you know, affecting change is so slow. And when we look at it from an Indigenous perspective, I think it's even slower. You know, Indigenous people have been dehumanized since contact, and it's still happening today. And, you know, trying to make arguments. And so one of the pieces of legislation that came out was the Act Respecting First Nation, Inuit, Métis Children, Youth, and Families, which came out in January 2020. Well, we've seen a couple of cases in 2020 that came out, and then suddenly, you know, the judges here in Ontario, and I have to be cautious about what I say, but they were very comfortable with deferring to the CYFSA instead of looking at this new piece of legislation. So now, like last year, there was a big push of education for the federal legislation, or I'm going to call it the Federal Act, you know, and the education on that. And one of my roles in my job is to try to educate my panel agents and, you know, have discussions with different communities, and the education piece is pretty important. But sometimes it's really hard when, you know, people are like, is it going to make a difference? And the default and the test under the federal legislation is the best interest of the child test. But when you keep that in the colonial system and the way of thinking, you know, how is that best interest test going to be any different than what they apply with the CYFSA? But I'll
Right.
pass it over to my sister before I
Mhm.
say something I shouldn't. So
So I get really
Whatever.
frustrated because I really think the federal act is really poorly drafted. But one of the things that they're trying to do is to actually address the systemic policies of genocide, assimilation, and oppression.
Mm.
And the difficulty that we have is in 2017, when the Child, Youth, and Family Services Act brought in the changes for Indigenous children, they basically try to assert change then, but again, it's like this, the legislation is determined by judges that are almost it's ingrained in them to maintain the status quo. So you can't create change, and the statistics keep getting worse and worse and worse. So when we get a newer judge that comes out and has a great decision, like I love Justice Wolf, her decisions are fantastic. She comes in and she actually gives decisions, and she's Indigenous. So when I look at the cases and I read the cases, I read them in a different way than other people read them. And like I read them in the way I think that she actually intends, as
Hmm.
opposed to how they interpret it because of their already colonial view of the world. So even just yesterday when I was arguing a motion, the judge, so there's factors that are supposed to be considered in the legislation dealing with the best interests of the children, you know, like physical, emotional, medical, educational, and
Mhm.
cultural needs, among numerous other issues that you need to think of when you're determining best interests. And my argument was that the cultural needs need to be given equal weight as the other needs, and you can't just pick and choose which one is going to be more important than the other. But there's already case law now that the judge himself was relying on, saying that whether the parent is Indigenous or not Indigenous doesn't really matter. And I'm thinking that in itself flies in the face of the whole system change that they're trying to create. But to try and express that, I mean, I did talk about the hard part and staying in the colonial box and trying to get out of this colonial box to make sure that the policy of assimilation doesn't continue is really, really hard, because you're like effectively trying to change the way that they themselves have been lawyers and how they were taught as lawyers. I'm not a big fan of lawyers. Like, I actually think that lawyers are there for a system, like the whole premise of our system. Everyone says, oh, our system is broken. Our system is not broken. Our system is designed to oppress, and we are figures in the oppression, the consistency and the oppression of the system. So to say, oh, we need to fix the broken system, no, we need to overhaul the system, because equality matters. Representation matters, freedom matters. And it doesn't matter whether you're Indigenous or you're not Indigenous, where you come from, who your people are. We should all be treated in a fair, consistent, and equal manner. And as soon as you have like thousands of Indigenous children that are not treated fairly and equally, and that's justified and asserted and continuing to be asserted through the system, then there's a problem. There's a problem.
Like,
Mhm.
even if you look at the Stats Canada, like 53% of the children in care are Indigenous.
In Canada,
Yeah,
it's gross.
that's unreal.
Gross is the word.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
exactly.
awful.
Yeah, I felt like I felt like I was just in the last act of In the Name of the Father. That was so good. That was such an impassioned plea. Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. I don't know if you know. I don't know if you've seen the last 5 minutes of In the Name of the Father, but it's that kind of concise.
Oh, Daniel Day-Lewis.
Yeah, Daniel Day-Lewis.
Yes.
You just Daniel Day-Lewis me just now. That was amazing. My father died in prison. Somebody didn't do. How dare you? It's very good.
My soapbox is really big, but it's
So
getting
good.
smaller
Love
as
it.
I get older.
Okay, well, going back to what you just said, I'm curious if what you bump into, and this is another loaded question for you, so brace for it. I think you're okay with it. Do you bump into more as a problematic thing, attitudes or law? What is a bigger obstruction for you? Is the attitudes or is the law in the way?
Yeah, good question.
I would have to say attitudes first, but only because the law is written, and I think it's poorly drafted legislation. And I think Canada continues to assert authority over Indigenous people. But the difference is we have laws. Haudenosaunee people have a great law that has existed since time immemorial, literally for like hundreds, if not thousands of years. And we have followed it. We never tried to kill our kids. We have never had a policy of trying to murder our children, unlike the Canadian government. Yet the Canadian government has their courts. They appoint their public servants to determine what's in the best interest of the Indigenous children that survive their policies, knowing that it's going to affect these kids for the rest of their lives. And the difficulty comes in with if you're getting a judge with the attitude where they are going to do what they think is right, pursuant to their subjective view of what is right, then that in itself is problematic. There's one case that I really struggle with, and it's a horrible case. It's the TE decision from the Court of Appeal. I struggle very strongly with it because the lawyers in Ontario call it the party case unless you're Indigenous. When you're Indigenous, it's actually a case where a First Nation in Ontario tried to assert their jurisdiction over one of their kids for a customary care agreement. And the Court of Appeal basically said, no, you need judicial oversight over this customary care agreement over one of your children. And since you even tried to assert jurisdiction and we're disagreeing with you on how you did it, we're going to order $10,000 of costs against you. So like that comes out of their child welfare budget. Like I'm thinking, are you seriously really coming out with decisions like that in 2023? Like this is like we're past 2000. Like this is literally 24 years now, but we've had this case out now since I think it was last year. But yes, it's a gross decision. And one of the things that drives me crazy in it is it's the facts are wrong. The Court of Appeal drafts this. I know the facts are wrong because I was part of the original decision from the Superior Court. And so it's difficult because the one lawyer ended up asserting that her client gives the kids traditional Indigenous cuisine, which includes corn soup, which it does, but she also includes hangover soup. And I was floored. Like, what is hangover soup? Like, it took me a month to find out what hangover soup is. Apparently, you could Google it, but I was too appalled to Google it. But so to me, once she puts that out there and the court does not make comment or reference to say, how could it possibly be traditional Indigenous cuisine when we didn't have pasta? We had tomatoes. We did not have pasta.
Right.
So, like, how is that traditional? Please explain. It's poverty food because we were not allowed to leave the reserve because you needed a pass to leave the reserve. So they brought in like poverty food that was cheap and easy to feed people because they wouldn't let us off the reserve. They took our guns. We couldn't go hunting. They really restricted what we had and the resources that we had. And then, like, without the court knowing that, and without the court saying something about it or holding her accountable to even saying, why was she allowed to say that and not get any reprimand from it, is beyond astounding to me because this is like the Court of Appeal of Ontario.
And the name of it.
Right.
Yeah. And that frustration that I'm seeing and hearing, like, this is something that I keep bumping into, is what I find fascinating is that every single thing that you said should not be controversial to anyone. Like anyone should hear those speeches and go, well, yeah, that just makes sense to me. And yet there are people who still exist walking this earth who are in the system that find your impassioned speech controversial, or and like that's the thing that I found frustrating too. And I found that okay, here's what I wanted to ask you. My wife and I have been endeavoring our best to get caught up with the things that we weren't taught in high school and elementary school. And it's been like a 10-year journey. And I think for the first 5 years of it, like speeches like you just said, I've been sharing stories like this that I've learned with other people. And for a long time, it would ice a room. Like you would see people avoid eye contact and take their drink and go, so the Jays game. I would see people turn away from me and look at me like I had a tinfoil hat, like I walked into the room screaming and into a banana peel. And then it's only been recently, like the past 5 years ish, that I have found people are listening now. And I found like I don't sound crazy anymore. And these stories now sound like I find the empathy has grown, and I have find the understanding is better. And I'm curious to hear if your experience is the same, and if you feel there is a bit of a shift, or if it's just the same old frustrating doors you're hitting up against.
So when I think about that piece, we had the RCAP report that came out in 1996, right? That had like 400 recommendations, something like that in there.
The most expensive Royal Commission report ever.
Yes, so it's the Royal Commission on Aboriginal people. And that came out in 1996. And then we have the Truth and Reconciliation report that came out in 2015. 2015. Anyway, so big gap.
MMIWG, years, everything says the same thing all the time, and it started earlier around the 70s.
Right.
So many those three reports, those three significant reports that were, commissioned by the government of Canada, they did set out the same basically recommendations, and a lot of them weren't implemented initially when the report came out. It was almost like it was ignored, totally ignored. And then the MMIWG report came out, and I believe it was 2019. And then in 2020 is when the 215 were found, right? The bodies in May of 2020. So and that's when, people were thinking, oh my God, now we have to be appalled. We found these children in unmarked graves from residential schools, right? But it was appalling for that year after those 215 were found. And my sister, that's when she actually started being more firm and standing higher up on her soapbox and not really, really filtering. She stopped filtering what she was saying, which, people need to hear that too. And I think at that point they were more ready for it anyway. But I don't think anybody knows, like after the 215 and then, a few of more graves of unmarked graves were found. And then suddenly it's like, even though that progression of, unmarked graves and, finding these Indigenous bodies, I think people stopped counting after a while because then they thought this is old news, and then some other piece came in. So I think for about a good year, I think it was heightened for sure, where people were prepared to listen. And maybe my sister can speak more on this, but there was the Idle No More movement, right?
Remember,
Right, and it's still ongoing, but no one here realizes that the Idle No More movement didn't just disappear, right? It was more publicized in the news around the world than it was here in Canada. So I'll let my sister take over for that because I know she'll have lots to say.
And it's funny because it is when the 215 came out that my colonial fragilityometer broke, and I totally
good. Get it.
And so now I say what I want because I had enough. And it's funny because the ignorance is prevalent. I think the difficulty, one thing I do say, and people really have a lot of difficulty and they do get quiet, is that Canadians benefit off the oppression of Indigenous people every single day. Every day. The fact that I live out Oneida, which is like 20 minutes from London, we are still on a boil water. We get water bottles, and it's very frustrating because it doesn't make sense. How does it make sense? Why is it okay? I don't know why it's okay.
Straight up offensive. It's a straight up offensive.
Yeah, if a subdivision in London didn't have water, like my gosh, it would be start of the news every night, every platform.
There was a class action that we ended up getting water money, and it was like really kind of sickening. It was about, so for I think it was 630 days, we got, I think it was like $2,400. And if you look at Walkerton, when they had theirs, I think there was like 11 days that they had the issue and they got $2,000. And to me, like, I'm like thinking, I don't care about getting the money, just fix it. Like, just fix it. Like, just you know what? I'm not going to say that I'm not happy, and I'm very grateful because I can shower in my water. There's a lot of First Nations people up north. They can't even shower in their water. They can't use their water. They can't touch their water. The water is actually contaminated, and it gets, like, they'll get really sick. So, I mean,
I was going to bring up, there are these reserves that still, all these years later, have this horrendous water that they cannot use, touch, drink, be anywhere near. Nothing's been done.
Right. Right. And it's been literally decades. And then it, like, when they send water to other continents, it just drives me crazy because I'm like thinking, like, hey, why don't you just fix, we're like half an hour away. like ours, like maybe because we live here in Canada, which is a very resource rich country. But
Mhm.
there's actually lawsuits from a lot of First Nations that are looking at settlements. Like they actually, when Canada became Canada, they sent, so England sent the trust fund dollars to Canada, at which time Canada used the trust fund dollars for a lot of Indigenous nations to build the foundation of Canada, which includes like Osgoode Hall and stuff like that. So they end up using it to build Ottawa, they end up using it to build their governing structures. And then now they're trying to be held accountable in a Canadian court. The difficulty is when you're trying to assert your rights in a Canadian court that has no benefit to actually say that we should have rights, then it's problematic. Like even the most recent Supreme Court case on the Reference Free Federal Act case, the premise was basically that like we still have to argue how we have inherent jurisdiction over our children. Like to me, that's pretty basic. Like we were here first, we had governing structures, our villages were tens of thousands of people, we had systems, we had politics, we had families that took care of each other, we didn't have jails, we didn't have poverty, we didn't have homelessness because we all lived in one big house. And so if we all starved, if someone was hungry, it's because we're all starving. So to me, like our system was so much kinder and more holistic and more environmentally conscious. And then, but it wasn't capitalist based, and it wasn't like colonial based on the whole premise of subjugation of people. Like even when you look at the land issues, a land acknowledgement, like they sit there and they have, I think a lot of people have a hard time acknowledging that there's more than one nation for the land because of the way the land was viewed. So we did not have fee simple title ownership of land. And that was not an assertion until the Royal Proclamation, really. So we had overlapping land rights with many, many First Nations, and we would use the same land, but at different times. And that's where I think that the huge difficulty comes in for people to even understand that. It's like we didn't do that. And it like they want us to do that. They still want us to be Canadian, they still want our land, and they still want our resources.
Yeah.
And but I'm gonna keep going on this little tangent just because
Yeah,
I think this
please.
part is important. When the Indian Act defines us, we do not get to define ourselves. And I think the problem with the Indian Act is that that's the only thing that's actually binding Canada to keeping what they agree to with all the treaties and stuff before. But when we don't get to define ourselves, then I think that is a huge issue. And when we're defined under legislation, then I think it's automatically going to be problematic because we are Indians under the Indian Act, my sister and I and our brothers. My sister and I have kids, and our kids are Indians under the Indian Act, and we're 6'2s, but they're lucky because they're 6'1s. So they can have kids with whoever they want to, and that's a section under the Indian Act. So when they have their kids, our girls, when they have their kids, they will be Indians under the Indian Act. All of our brothers have kids, and all of our brothers' kids are not status Indians. So they are actually not Indians under the Indian Act. So they have no benefit of being Indian despite our brothers being their parents. So to me, there's a huge irony where this Canadian system gets to determine what's right and just in this oppressive system that continues our oppression.
Mhm. Well, you mentioned the Indian Act. Whenever people are, show some patience and they listen to stories like this, and they listen to people like you, or they listen to, people like me who are trying to get them caught up on stuff, and you see that little glimmer of hope in their eye, and you can see that their empathy is kind of dripping off of them, and they want to learn more. And there's a bit of guilt and there's sadness, and it's all there. I usually recommend them to read 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. The book's about this thick. And it's a really good start. It was kind of my Morpheus, to use a Matrix term. It kind of like I took the red pill and off I went, and my life was changed forever. And me reading it, I think it took me 8 months to read that book because every other page is a jaw-dropping chapter, and I had to throw it across the room and storm off and learn about something else. Like it just you're constantly struck by shocking things. And you flippantly sort of touched upon something that I've been regularly amazed by my entire life, growing up in a very high Indigenous culture per capita in a 3,000 person town, and then going to Canada College in North Bay, Ontario. over and over and over again, I am amazed at how respectful I am treated, even when I knew nothing. Even when I didn't even start my education, even when I wasn't taught anything, there was such an unbelievable respect. What made me think about it is you talking about your shower. It's like, well, at least I can shower with the water. There are some people who can't even drink it, and you're finding a silver lining in something terrible. And this is a thing that I've seen over and over and over again from the Indigenous community is I have no stories, literally zero. I have no examples of a time when I was treated poorly by Indigenous people from a racist lens. Because I'm a straight white male living in North America, I literally have no examples of somebody treating me poorly because of who I am. And of course there's never an excuse for racism, but man, oh man, if I would never fault somebody for reaching the end of their patience or losing their cool on me because I look like their oppressor. I would never fault somebody for that. And yet I've never sensed it. I've never felt it. I've never experienced it. And I tip my cap because it astounds me of the resolute and the patience and basically, yeah, basically the respect and the patience that your community has over and over again in the face of inexcusable travesty. This is me giving you a compliment, which I know you're uncomfortable with.
Wow. Wow. You know, growing up, I have a different experience, Derek. Growing up,
Okay.
my father was always very supportive and, you know, endless curiosity. So we did attend quite often, outside Brantford, the school and the museum, and it was a regular stop. But, and this is something I want to wade into and help me along here. I was never the magic of the Indigenous spirituality. I always found a little difficult because I've always been a humanist. Um, you know, not of any religion. The spirituality was always loomed so large that I had trouble kind of getting through that in order to understand the day-to-day challenges and issues of my neighbors. As I did with maybe other cultures that I lived with. And I know I'm being clumsy here in my language, but I want to kind of look at this as a humanist to help our members speak to that, because I belong to a group of women here who have an Indigenous study group. What they study is the spirituality of the Indigenous people, and they feel that is what they're doing to try to understand. That frustrates me, and I know that for someone who comes to it without spirituality, there is that bit of that fog that it's hard to get through. And I please, that's clumsy, so help me along with that.
Well, we can't brush all Indigenous communities with the same brush, right? So we all have
Sure.
our
Yep.
different ways of ceremonies and connections. But essentially, the spirituality for most Indigenous communities, like all over the world, is the connection to the land, right? The connection to the land, that everything on Mother Earth is connected, and we're all living things. We're all have the right to exist. No one and no living thing is better than the other. And if you know, someone, if a life is given to provide life to someone else, I mean, of course you should celebrate, not the kill, that's not the reason, but to thank, you know, for that living thing, for, you know, the substance or whatever, as a human, right? But I think the connection is more, and the spirituality is always tied to Mother Earth.
I think that's exactly the connections, the relationships and the connections that is the first thing that they attacked when they got here, because it's the language and the children and the women that really ultimately make your community. The language helps you understand who you are in relation to the world. And one of the things is they did not like our language and neighbor languages. And because our languages are actually very, very different. So I got this, you can't really see it, but it's this,
Yeah.
it's like, it actually means great peace. So on my 50th birthday, I decided I'm gonna get this for my birthday, and I'm gonna try and live every day with a great peace and wake up with a good mind. And so one of the things that I wanted to get on my other arm, which I haven't, I have one tattoos and I get one right there, and I wanted to get the word power. So one side is peace, one side is power. And I went around and I asked a number of people about how like what's the word for power? So this is great peace. We all know that Skanakvo is great peace. And so there is no translation for the colonial word of power. So when you actually, in our language, there's no assertion of power and control per se. So what you say is, I have strength or I have resilience. So that's the way it defines. And if you look at the way that the language is, there's a lot of words that we don't have because it's not in our language because we didn't think about things in those ways. So when they got here and there was no literal translation to a lot of their words because people came and they were already subjugated by the whole idea of kings and queens and dominance and paying taxes and being part of this thing where you don't own anything. You really here, even still, people don't own land because it's fee simple and they can take it whenever they want. But really, like it was that attack on our language and then the attack on the children to stop to remove the Indianness from the children and then to raise them to be like nice little white kids that they were never going to be. And then the attack on our women, which is still happening now. If you look at MMIT, the murder missing Indigenous women and girls, it's still happening now. And one of the things that is really frustrating, and I actually removed myself from Facebook because when you're Indigenous and you're on Facebook, you have a lot of people that you see. The feeds that you see are from all across the country and they're real feeds from real Indigenous people and they're put on and you're seeing them, which you would never see in the news. Like you would never see this stuff in the news because it's really like really oppressed or repressed and they don't want Canadians to see it because they prefer for people to live in ignorance than to see what's going on. And one of the things that really frustrated me is the Buffy St. Marie issue when it came up. So, but that's not why it's frustrating me, why you guys are thinking about it. What's frustrating me is the fact that they brought it up at the same time when they were trying to have all these news press articles and all these things to get the women out of the dump in Winnipeg. The Indigenous women buried in the dump in Winnipeg has not been part of the news since Buffy came out. And no one's heard anything about it. Bob Canoe, or whatever his name is, I think it's Bob Canoe.
Bob Canoe, yeah. The Premier of Manitoba?
Yeah, so he's Indigenous. He said he's going to do something about it, but I haven't heard anything. And that frustrates me because like it's one of those things where it's totally off the grid now. People don't care, people don't know. Cindy Gladio's pelvis was used as an exhibit in court for the charges against the guy that was done. And then it's my understanding that they actually lost the pelvis. And so no one loses a pelvis. Someone took it. Like, why did you even have an Indigenous woman's pelvis there in the first place? Like, why did they have to physically, to me, it's appalling that these things continue to happen. So it's the attack against our children, which we know 53% of our children are in care or involved with the society across Canada. We know that Indigenous women are still having issues. We know that they don't want to help contribute to the language basis in order to try and get more Indigenous people. Like chronic underfunding of education is significant. I actually paid tuition for my daughter to go to school in town. So I took a teaching program because I really thought about changing. So I actually have a Bachelor of Education and I'm on the OCT list. but I didn't do it because when I did the practicums, the differentiation in education was so significantly different because of the chronic underfunding that, like, my husband and I chatted and we decided we were going to put our daughter in school in town. And one of the difficulties that we had with that, which was really, really hard to I still struggle with that decision now, is that she has a disconnect now because she didn't grow up with the kids in her community at the community school. But she technically is bilingual because she passed the DELF and she did really well, and she has the BT, so she can say she's bilingual and work as in French wherever she wants and anywhere. So it's like this thing where I'm like, oh, you got to figure out what's going to be best for her. And I guess we'll see. I won't be able to see that probably for another 10 years, but we'll have to, she's 19 now and she's in university, but she's awesome. And so my concern though is that with the attack on education, with the attack on languages, with the attack on our children, with the attack on our women, it's not going away. And the hard part is it's finally starting to get some recognition with people like you guys where you're getting it. And it's like, I don't know, it's like just short of some huge systemic overhaul of this broken system, then I think it's just propagating the same statistics.
Mhm.
Christina,
Well,
you
well,
touched on
okay.
colonialism that is permeating to this day. It's institutionalized at this point. And you mentioned there was actually a couple of points that I kind of would like to circle back on just for my own personal curiosity. How much, so you had systems in place, you had cultures, you had your own justice systems, you've had all of these things in place. This government comes over, as you pointed out, that the people are from a totally different system and want to put that power play. And then they steal the women, they steal the children, they do everything they and eradicate the languages, to do everything to displace and make you fit in or just eradicate. So going back to the number of children that are in care, 53%. So I just find it interesting and ironic that here you had a system and now they're not allowing your children to go back into your communities because your system, you're broken, but this is the system that broke you guys in the first place. So this whole catch-22. But how much of the number of children are they using as an excuse that, oh, there's not enough kinship? I'm not sure what the word is that I want to use, but that there's not an appropriate kinship for this child to go into in order to stay with the family, or how much of it is, oh, we don't have enough Indigenous foster care families and the kinship, well, we're removing this child, obviously there's not an appropriate amount in the extended family. So how much of that is an excuse? How much of that is an issue? How much of that would you like to see changed in terms of how
All of it. All of it. The whole system, the whole system is gross. And then, like, one of the problems that they have is they always say it's a resource issue, and it's a resource issue for everything. And but the thing about it is, it's like for a lot of Indigenous people, they don't want to invite the society into their home. They don't want to say, well, I'll take my cousin or my niece or my nephew or my grandchildren, but really I don't want to deal with them. Like, I don't want to deal with the society. And my house has issues. There's stuff that, you know, our house might not be big enough. And like, I mean, if you think about it, my husband was awesome. Like, he was like so awesome. And the house he lived in had no hydro and it had no indoor plumbing. And he was just like awesome. And he had a rough go, a really rough youth. And he ended up going to university, and that's where I met him. And he was just like so resilient and so like awesome. But that was like something where he overcame that, and he actually ended up becoming a lawyer at 40 because he ended up doing other stuff. And so I think if you look at like, would he have been as awesome if he were removed and placed in care with a non-Indigenous family? I don't know. I don't know if that would have been something like the way that benefits Canadians, or I think education, the system of education is the first basis of institutionalization for children to learn how to be Canadian and learn how to be members, good members of society, to get them ready to work, to basically contribute to the system and make sure that the system is running smoothly so that the rich people can stay rich and we're all contributing to that. So if we look at how they're trying to push that into our systems, our kids don't often learn very well in the same system because they are not good with desks, they're not good with the structure, they're not good with trying to conform to how a student is typically supposed to learn. They're actually finding a lot of non-Indigenous kids don't learn that way either, but it's like this, because the way that it's implemented, then it's like this whole forcing of it. So like, I think, just coming back to your question, I think that the whole system is broken. And I think that until they actually look at having it where we get to say, hey, what about this? And then have it respected by the courts instead of argued, because it doesn't, it's not confined within their colonial box.
So even with going back to like the home, like say if you have a kin placement that's prepared to take the child, I mean, it might be a home that has, you know, an outhouse, right? Or or wood stove, right? Which, you know, if you put and apply the standards that the ministry implements, then they're going to sit there and say it's not a suitable house, right? First of all, the wood stove would be a hazard, but meanwhile, for this family, it's what heats up heats up their house during the winter time.
Yeah.
And then so the federal legislation, the federal act that came out in 2020 was supposed to help address the issue of the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care. And under that piece of legislation, the federal act confirmed that Indigenous communities had have the inherent jurisdiction over the child and family services of their children. So we have this, you know, piece of legislation that's saying we have it and confirming it because the federal government is recognizing it. But yet, you know, despite that confirmation, the courts are still saying we need to do the judicial oversight of that inherent jurisdiction. But which is, you know, it doesn't make any sense overall. But also in the federal act, there's the ability of different First Nations communities to get engaged in coordination agreements, to develop their own child welfare laws, right? And I'm thinking, okay, first of all, I took insult to that piece because it implies that the First Nations communities were lawless, right? So you can develop your child welfare laws. It's like, you mean put it in writing so that it makes it easier for you to understand, despite the fact that this, you know, the communities have had their own laws since time immemorial, right? It's just not written, it's passed down through tradition and even the spirituality piece, right? So, yeah, so now you have these communities that are engaging under the federal legislation because, from my perspective, it's a big piece for the source of the funding. That's how these First Nations are going to get their funding once they implement their child welfare laws under the federal act. So we have some nations that are doing it, and we'll see how it goes. You know, it's still relatively, I would say, I hate to say it because it's been out since 2020, but a lot of the nations are now saying, hey, and I think a lot of nations were actually waiting until the February 9th referendum question on the federal act to come out before they started asserting and implementing their legislations. But yeah, so hopefully with some of these nations, by the way, when they enter into the coordination agreements, they have to have certain provisions in the legislation, right? Even though they're asserting their own inherent jurisdiction, there has to be certain things in their legislation to be what would be qualified under the legislation of C-92.
Mm.
So it in itself, it's still, nations are still having to seek the permission from both the Canadian and federal government to assert their inherent jurisdiction over their children. It,
Well, wow. You've painted quite a picture here. And it's very clear in this hour that we've been talking that your road is very rocky, and I've heard everything. I mean, I'm being, I'm being euphemistic, but you've said more than once, tear the whole thing down. So we've got a picture here. So in the spirit of trying to make this rocky road that you're on a little smoother, because it seems like you've got potholes here, and you've got no, you cannot pass this barrier. There's like a lot. I'm going to spare you the construction analogies, but you get my idea. There's a lot of problems on this road that you're on. So let's try to clear it up for you a little bit in some way, as best we can with our little viewership here. In the spirit of allyship, and I think that's the reason why I was called into this call in the first place, is because I'm endeavoring to be as best an ally as I can, and that's why I have the privilege of talking to you today. At least that's what I think. Betty Ann, is that fair? Is that fair to say? Is that why I was called in today? Okay, good. So I would love to know, from where you're standing, what makes a good ally? And my follow-up, the sort of second part of this, is I would love to focus more on even well-meaning people. What is a thing that you bump into or are frustrated by? Because sometimes racism is obvious, like you mentioned, the hangover soup. That's one that's clear and present and obvious. But sometimes you have more subtle obstructions from even well-meaning people. So what is, if you had a magic wand, what's the thing you would like to clear up from people? What makes a good ally? And what is a common misstep that you see from people that you'd love to clear up?
I always like to hear, like yourself, Derek, people trying to educate themselves, right? Educating themselves, not just relying on, my sister and I coming up, and then,
Right.
we have a conversation, and then suddenly that's the only, information that they're receiving. Take it further.
The internet's a real thing.
Right. Yeah. And there's books. Oh my God, there's still libraries. There's still paper books. There's still there's
Exactly.
lots of, there's a lot of misinformation on the internet too, and a lot of misinformation in the history books. But mind you, there are pieces, you can piece it together and see where the racist and derogatory are. Like, it wasn't uncommon to read a book about Indigenous people and read the word savage, right? Right.
Ugh.
And that was common up until friggin' what, the 1960s. Like, we're talking, like, even today, like, some people would use that word, right? And then even like I think it's always nice when people ask about the political correctness on, how do you refer to yourself as like First Nation, Indigenous, like how, or because you still have some people that are saying Native, right? Which 20 years ago that was the word, right? Or Aboriginal.
Right.
And some people took that word too, to sit there and go, Aboriginal, what do you mean? Like, I'm an original person, and with the ab in front of it, it makes it sound like we're abnormal, right?
Right.
So I always think the education piece, the understanding, and not being offensive about like coming across as, if a comment's made, sit there and be offended by, hey, it's not me that's doing this to you, right? It wasn't me that,
Right.
I wasn't the one. But it's like, okay, a good ally would be like, yeah, I understand where you're coming from. I get the history of colonialism. I understand, that Indigenous people are dehumanized. I want to learn more, and I will take that step, right? That's what makes a good ally in my perspective.
I agree. I actually think that's the wanting to learn more and become more aware. One of the things that I always present on, one of the very, very first things I say is that in North America, if you live here, you are a treaty person. Like, it's not just the Indigenous people that are the treaty people. We are all treaty people in North America. Like, so for people to think that they're not, it's like your government has benefited from these treaties. Just because you're government continues to benefit from not following the treaties does not make it right.
Mhm.
And so we're on the premise that we're all treaty people, then we should basically understand. And one of the things, I have conversations with people that tell me that they're allies on one hand, but then they say that they don't think that they themselves should have to pay for the sins of their ancestors. And I'm like, okay, I get that, but we have to live every single day. Our lives are lived in the consequence of the ongoing sins that you're living by taking advantage of these treaties and using our resources against us. And so, like, when I'm dealing with a lot of things, like when my husband died, like I had to deal with so much stuff because of the Indian Act, which is totally different than the estate legislation off reserve. So in order to say, hey, I know that you get the benefit from being Canadian, because most Canadians love Canada. And so I have no problem with you loving Canada. Go ahead and love Canada. It's good to love where you are. I love being Haudenosaunee. I am Oneida. I'm Haudenosaunee. I'm Turtle Clan. I'm not Canadian. And just because the government decides in 1956, it's either 54 or 56, 6 to 8 years after so when the Citizenship Act was passed, they actually excluded Indigenous people. So they didn't include Indigenous people until about 4 or 6 years later. And then the whole premise of including Indigenous people was to enfranchise them on a whole, because since Canada became Canada, since before Canada, there was a Gradual Enfranchisement Act, there was a Gradual Civilization Act. And then the Gradual Enfranchisement Act basically tried to say, you need to enfranchise, and had all these terms, but we'll discuss that at the next one. And so the difficulty I have is that it's this allyship and people are trying to learn more, but it's the ignorance that is there that they still need to keep open on. Because it's like when you're surprised when someone says something, then feel free to ask for clarification. Because if you're just trying to say, oh no, it's not like that, then I'm just gonna stop talking and walk away. I love talking to people when their cup isn't full, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. Yeah, I get that. Yeah. For me, I say you have to also unlearn things. It's not just about learning things. It's about unlearning the things you've been taught your whole life. And
100%.
that was a big one for me. That was a big one for me, was just like reconciling the fact that my entire, almost head to toe, start to finish, my education system failed me almost stem to stern. And so you have to acknowledge that first. And you also have to get over the fact that nobody's calling you a bad person. There's this wonderful guy named Rick who goes to the same school my daughter does. And we'll get into this. We'll get into these conversations. I'll come with a new chapter that I just read. I'm like, can you believe this? I'll be shaking my fist about the Oka crisis or something. And I'll be coming in real hot. And Rick is the one who will go, hey, just be easy on them. They didn't know. They weren't taught this. They were led astray, and you got to dial it down. And he's always the one who has to talk me off the ledge. He's the one that gets me to cool my temper a little bit. So what I usually do for people who have that, like I talked about, that glimmer in the eye, and you can almost see an ally forming. It's almost like you can see them coming around and going, my God, I want to fix this. I want to make up for lost time. I want to get caught up. What I usually recommend is I go with 21 things you should know about the Indian Act. I tell them just take a look at the 7 grandfather teachings and look up your address on nativeland.ca. I would love if you could add to that list. Like, what does a good ally look like to you, and what would you like more people to do to be part of the solution, not part of the problem?
I think asking questions from everyone, not just Indigenous people. Like I don't know what it is. I don't think I look excessively friendly, but people will just come over and just
That's not fair, but continue.
well, it's weird. Like I literally, like 4 or 5 times, like strangers, I didn't know about everything that was going on. And like this one lady, she must have been in her 60s, and she was so sad.
Yeah.
And she's like, and when she saw me, because I actually, I'm wearing black today because I couldn't find my orange shirt, but I actually have like 6 orange shirts. And I'm like, where are they today? But
Mhm.
anyways, so I wear orange and then they just come up and like, I didn't know. And it's like with the 215, it was around that time and people were just coming up. And it's like, yeah, your government did this. Your government actually figured out how to establish the Canada's food guide by starving Indigenous children. And
Yeah.
they literally used Indigenous children to and people to try and figure out what was good and what was bad. And they like, and then they're like, it's just like this shockness because there was no one there to stand up for kids. And there was no way that Indigenous people even had a right to get a lawyer till like really, really late. And then they were wondering why everything's coming out now, because really in the last 50 years, that's when we were allowed to get lawyers. And that's when we were allowed to assert our rights. We were allowed to leave the reserve. We were allowed to do these things that we weren't allowed to do before. And then it's just problematic. And one of the things that a lot of Canadians don't know is the fastest growing population right now is the Indigenous population. They have more Indigenous people under 25 than there are over 25. And it's like, be ready. Like, be ready. That's like,
So I
Yeah.
just wanted to add to that is that, so 7 grandfather teachings is great, but that doesn't apply to every First Nation across
Right.
North America. So find out how many nations there are actually, like First Nation and even the Inuit communities and the Métis communities. I mean, they're all important communities. So find out
Yeah.
how many there are, find out how many there are just in the general area, how many are in
Yeah.
each province, right? What the different languages are. And because that's one of the problems is that when people talk about, like, even when we have the discussion, sometimes it's like I have to remind it, like, it's great just to use the word Indigenous, right? And but at the same time, yes, we're Haudenosaunee, right? So and we should start using that more, but we don't want to disregard the other people
Right.
like here to sit there and say we want to exclude them. That's why we generally speak about Indigenous pieces and Indigenous people in a general sense. But I think it's important to know that we're different. Like we're all our nations are different. We have some languages, different communities might speak Ojibwe, but they have a different dialect, right?
Right.
So, yeah, we all have our different teachings. As Haudenosaunee people, we do not have the 7 grandfather teachings. That's an Ojibwe thing,
Okay.
right? So, and my sister mentioned earlier, Haudenosaunee, we have the Great Law of Peace, right? So, it's important to recognize that we're not all the same.
one little fun fact I'm going to share with you is
Please.
that
Please
um,
do.
so the Great Law was actually implemented during a solar eclipse. So when they actually brought it and all the
Oh.
weapons were to be put under the tree, they were trying to get other people, and then they were able to basically make the sky during the day dark. And then so that was enough on the day of the solar eclipse to get all the nations to agree. And that's how it was actually formed. So they know that this path right now that's going to be tomorrow is the first time that this path has been taken in like 1,000 years or something. I can't remember the exact date, but it's like 1,000 years ago is when they think. So they actually have ideas about when they think it might have been formed, but they have different dates as to when this particular path of the solar eclipse it covers the homelands. So it's actually the path is covering the homelands of Haudenosaunee people, which goes like through Ohio into New York. Like if you look at the way the New York Thruway and then the 401 follow all the way up into Quebec, like that's basic. Like that, it's not a coincidence that the highways are there. Like those are pathways.
Fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is a fun fact. You weren't joking. That was fun. That's exactly what that was. That's fascinating. Yeah. Okay. And not to put too fine a point on it, but I would love to ask this too. I remember when I was involved in LGBT activism, people like my grandmother who were totally on side and were there would find themselves saying stuff like, "Oh yes, I absolutely support the gay lifestyle." Like like she would say stuff that was warm and kind and loving, but there was just a little like, okay, it's not a lifestyle. This is just part of the human condition. Are there any terms floating out there that just make your eyebrow twitch a bit? Like, is there anything like, let's not say that anymore. Do you have any of those that are sticking on you?
Oh my God.
It's too many.
Yeah, we try to push things out of our mind. When I was younger, when we were going to school, we heard the word squaw a lot.
Oof.
We were that. Yeah, we were called like savages. We were called dirty, and we were, yeah, like you're just, you know, horrible, or Indian, like you're ugly. Like we heard all sorts of
Oof.
stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah, and we actually, there was like religious people that came over and told us. I don't think they realized we were Indigenous because they told us that Indians were sent over to North America and we're brown because we're evil, and that like God
Yikes.
Punished us.
punished. Yeah, so we became. That's why we're brown. I'm like, okay. I don't think he
Yikes. Yeah.
realized he was in our house, but
Yeah.
it's stuff like that, and there's other worse words like they have other worse words, and it's just like whatever. And it is hard, but a lot of it is nice because even though like it's only been like 25-30 years, a lot of change has actually happened. And like I a lot of people have a hard time with like change. What I'm finding right now is talking to like some white men, they feel like the attack now is on them. And I'm like, don't even get me started. Just because the pendulum started moving a little tiny little bit,
Totally.
like it's like they feel attacked.
Mhm.
It's like, don't feel attacked. You're only feeling attacked because you're taking it in this personal way where it's like the equality, we're trying to assert equality and rights for Indigenous children. Another thing that we have is as Indigenous people, we're born into roles and responsibilities. We are not born into rights and privileges. And I think non-Indigenous people are born into rights and privileges. And I think that's the way that they're taught how to be as little people growing up. Whereas Indigenous people are generally born and we have these roles that we have to fulfill, and we have these things that we have to, responsibilities that are automatically put on us as soon as we're basically born. And there's a difference.
Oh, Christina, you worded that so well. Thank
Yeah.
you. That was wow.
Yeah, that's great. And if it's any consolation for you, I have as sitting up here on my pile of white privilege, I have never felt attacked. I have only felt welcomed by this community my entire life, and that's being immersed and immersing myself any chance I've had. I've always felt welcomed, and every single victory that I've seen from any of the communities is as I see as a victory for this land. I see it as a victory for humanity, and I always have, and I'm looking forward to more of them. I want to see many more victories. That's what I want.
It only enriches us
Yep.
as human beings, you know, to understand the culture and the land and the history of our land and the people that were here before us. And I like that. We'll continue to expand around us. Jill, do you have anything before I close?
Yes, I'm a very practical person. So what can we do locally, provincially, federally to help things along?
I always think that's a great question, and I get to ask that. And I mean, the only thing I can really say is, like, contact your member of parliament and your member of provincial parliament to basically say, like, why is stuff being ignored? Like, why is there a water issue? Why is it okay for Indigenous, like, representation or chronic overrepresentation in every significant negative system in Canada, including healthcare, like healthcare and education and child welfare and even incarceration. Suicide rates drives me crazy when there was a lot last year. It's just like really, really sad. And then right now there's a huge drug epidemic across Canada with everyone, and it has a serious, significant impact on a lot of reserves in a major way. So I don't know what else to say other than that, because the government just continues to ignore it. Because if you set it aside and you ignore it, it'll go away. Like it's going to go away. And they've been saying that for over 150 years.
Literally. Yeah, literally.
Yeah, And with the residential schools, you know, some of the perpetrators of the abuse were still alive. They were never charged.
And they're still getting they're they're still alive and they're still getting like pensions
Right.
from
Right. And why not question that? Like, so those are pieces why people don't think of it. Like, why weren't they like charged? Like, we have war crime criminals, you know, that are in their 80s, 90s that are being prosecuted. And it's like, why not do that? Like, they're part of the genocide,
That's
right?
right.
So, and oh, I was gonna say I forgot about the other. Oh, the even the damages when it comes to Indigenous people suing, right? Like we tend to see lesser awards, awarded amounts for Indigenous people as compared to non-Indigenous people.
100%. And then we have deadlines. Like why? So there's no limitation periods on a lot of things except for Indigenous people. And because the government wants to clean up. And even when they did want it, so I mean, if we look at Germany and we look at everything that happened with the Nazis and with the Jews, they literally have museums to sit there and show everyone why we can't do this again, why this is an issue, why we need to learn from our history and our mistakes. But in Canada, they actually have tried to destroy all the records and they're trying to hide it and burn down the schools and make sure that it's like this secret that never comes up, and the awareness and the evidence is gone. And they've literally, like starting from Harper, I think it was, they've literally started destroying records. And it's like, why? Like, why are you trying to destroy records? Because out of sight, out of mind, and it's easier if we're all dead.
And I think part of the problem that even when you do have the discussions, if you do call the MPP or your MP, the reality is that the racism and dehumanization of Indigenous people is so ingrained in this institution and in the government that it tends to, it's like, isn't that the normal thing to do? Isn't that how we're supposed to, you know, we're not supposed to consider them people. So it's really hard to get people to actually, you know, take the stance. Like even so, even with the I don't know more like movement, right? At that point, then suddenly it was just buried under everything. It was made worldwide news, but at the same time, it was pushed aside here so that no one would see it,
Yeah.
right?
And I would think at that point, we so much emphasis on what the Pope would say about it. Who cares at that point what the Pope would
Yeah.
say? Like
Right.
that became the headline and took away from the
Yep.
entire, you know, the criminal part of the issue. Like that just anyway.
It's actually interesting with the Pope, though, if you look at it, though, because the Pope, when he got here, so the focus on Canada's assertion of authority is the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery is based on terra nullius. It's actually a papal decree that was made that asserts that if you're not Christian, then you are not people and you're not human. So when that happened and contact happened, we were not human and we were basically treated like cows. So like that's where, I mean, there's a lot of people, especially in like the South, where they would eat them because they were like cows. And you're not, if you're not Christian, you're not human. Or they would have sex with our women, and then because they would have sex, it was considered bestiality and they were going to go to hell. So they actually had to change that. And so that assertion, the doctrine of discovery, was a big thing when the Pope came, because when the Pope came, they actually asked, like, they wanted it rescinded. And that what they did, yeah, right, because it is a premise. It is the premise of colonial assertion of control, power, and authority for the Canadian government. And so when which the Canadian government still relies on and still has used it in case law within the last 2 decades. So when they assert that, and with the Pope basically saying it's been repudiated, then Canada is still enforcing it because they do not have a right at the point of saying that they, like with the Royal Proclamation, they basically asserted their authority, and a lot of it was premised on the doctrine of discovery. So really, it's a gross, disgusting system premised on the genocide, assimilation, and oppression of Indigenous people right from the start. And then they came and they saw how resource rich our country, our like the whole like continent was really. And then it just like started this frenzy. And then it started changing our systems to basically align with colonial systems. And that, I think, is the biggest problem that we have.
Right, right. Well, I'm going to wrap this up, but we are coming back. June 9th, we're going to do a live discussion open to anyone that wants to participate. And a lot of the same faces here, but thank you, Christina and Maureen. This was difficult to listen to, but so valuable. And thank you for that, to take the time to walk us through this, things that you shouldn't have to continue to tell us. I'm the big royal us, but thank you for your patience in doing that. Again, June 9th, we'll be back, and please look at all of our platforms for more information on that. Thank you to all who've attended that will watch this recording via, again, all of our platforms. All of our programming is generously supported by our members and our donors. And please watch our website. And to those watching who are not a member, please consider becoming a member, because it does indeed, Humanist Canada is the voice of humanism in Canada, and our role is to bring all of these Canadian voices forward and ensure that they are heard. We want more involved. So thank you very much, everyone. Really good discussion, and we'll see you.